My name is Tanisha Legault Washington. I am the interim director at UChicago UTEP, the Urban Teacher Education Program. I am super excited to have so many of you join us this afternoon. We created this series to really be a resource and support to teachers during these uncertain times where the world has changed and the idea of teaching is also changing. We are currently in the midst of a global pandemic and an uprising where racial tensions and inequities that have existed since the birth of this country is coming to a head. The job of the teacher during this time is essential. Teachers have the responsibility and the privilege of helping our youth navigate the current reality and to help teach and empower our youth to change the world as they see it. Teachers are essential. I'm excited to see so many teachers that have signed up for our workshop series, which really speaks to the commitment to your own growth and development. I hope many of you were able to join us for last week's session led by Dr. Joel Jackson and Dr. Mashiri Keels. That session focused on self-care because as educators, we must first come to this work whole in order to help others. We got some great information and strategies, and anyone that missed that session can check out the recording on the PD website. I am super excited about today's session and our panelists today. UTEP's own Dr. Kei Fujiyoshi, along with several of our amazing UTEP alumni, are going to share information with you about approaching the work through the lens of anti-racism. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders. One, we want to let everyone know that this is a recorded session meant to be shared so that if there's anyone that is not present today, they can have access to the information, and this training will be posted. Also, for those educators that are seeking CPDUs for attending today, there will be a link in the chat towards the end of the training where you will find your evaluation form, and that will include your email address. After completing this, the evidence of completion form will be sent to you. Also, attendees can elect for closed captioning feature by clicking on the closed captioning icon, the gray bar that is on the bottom of the screen. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge and thank members of our planning team, our Dean, Deborah Gorman-Smith, who led the charge in creating this opportunity for teachers, our planning team, Adrian Tolbert, Dwayne Davis, Maggie Walsh, and Carmela and Sid, who are in charge of our technology today. A big thank you for all our presenters, and a big thank you. I want to thank and acknowledge the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation. They are funding this initiative so that this training could be offered to teachers free of charge. With no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kei Fujiyoshi to get us started today. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time out of your day and out of your week. We're really excited to be speaking with you today, and hopefully that this will be a very fruitful session, especially during these times in which we're living in. This conversation is really important, thinking about just our historical moment in the context of the history of our nation. And we're hoping that all of you are coming here today to make some sort of intervention. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with all of you, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so today what we want to talk about is anti-racism, but in this context of anti-racism really being all about love. And we're going to go through some practices of love today. Let me get my screen fixed here. Sorry, everybody. Okay, just to get our agenda going for today, we wanted to sort of set some expectations, what to expect. We're going to be talking about prerequisites for anti-racist work. What does that actually mean? We're going to be talking about some reflections on the process, and some of our former UTEP students are here to share some of their reflections on being involved in this and what that work is like. And then lastly, we're going to share some examples from our teaching practice. What not to expect, a certificate of anti-racist completion. One of the things that we want to reiterate and also just emphasize is that this work is ongoing, that there is no 10-step easy program to this, and that also please, if one thing is also not to expect an absolution of guilt. Part of this work is also being in a place of vulnerability, being in a place of honesty. And sometimes that might lead us with uneasy feelings. You know, we may not walk away always feeling happy. But at the same time, we really want to dig deeper into this work. We feel like it's really, this is the time to do that, especially in thinking about this upcoming school year and how we want to enter. And so just some guidelines for the chat session. We wanted, and these are some guidelines that we also set at UTEP. Use I statements. Think about why you're saying something, what you're saying, and why you're saying it, for what purpose. Note if there's anything that makes you uncomfortable. So in class sometimes, you know, whether it's a comment from somebody that's being made or something that we're saying up here, sometimes it's good just to kind of keep track of, you know, what are those things that are make you uncomfortable? Where does that discomfort lie? Where does it sit? And, you know, how is it that we kind of wrestle with it? So we would suggest maybe keeping some sort of writing method on hand, just to kind of keep track of that. And then lastly, please be present. We know that it's easy to get zoomed out. So as best as possible, we just ask that you stay with us. Also feel free to use the chat box. And so just to get us started with introductions, I want to go ahead and just begin by saying thank you so much to our UTEPers who gave up so many hours in, you know, preparing for this conversation. You know, every time we're like, okay, well, an hour, like 2.5, 3. So in preparation for this talk that we're having today, I just want to say thank you all so much for all the time that you put into this. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce the rest of our presenters today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Watkins Kane. I'm a third grade teacher at William H. Brown in the city's West Side. I joined this panel to provide additional perspective as a Black woman on a mission to empower students at a predominantly Black school. I believe that in helping and supporting, the more diverse our perspectives are, the more well-rounded we are as humans, for ourselves, for society, and for others. So I'm hoping to share some nuggets that I've gained and to help others today.
Thank you, Danielle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Eshkar. I use she, her pronouns. I just graduated from UTEP cohort 16 this June, and I'm entering my first year as a lead teacher in a 5th grade self-contained classroom at Moose Elementary School. As a white woman who grew up in a middle and upper middle class suburb in New Jersey, I had access to a high quality public education that affirmed my identity and helped me grow. And the reality is that many students of color are denied that opportunity because of the racism endemic to our society. I see anti-racist education as essential to the safety and well-being of our students and communities. And I think it's a necessary step as part of reparations for the centuries of violence perpetuated against communities of color. I'm humbled to be here with the opportunity to share some of my lessons from the start of my journey amongst such a collection of talented educators.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sean Murphy. I use he, him pronouns. I was in UTEP's cohort 14, and I'm about to enter my 3rd year as a 6th to 8th grade science teacher at Fisk Elementary, Woodlawn neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And I'm here as a white male teacher who teaches Black children, and I'm in a position of power to either participate in or disrupt the school to prison pipeline. I believe that the white supremacist philosophies that created that pipeline between schooling and prison aren't going to end until white people speak to it and work to dismantle it. So first and foremost, I'm here as a learner with the understanding that I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to be speaking to my experiences working with Black students in ways that attempt to affirm their importance, their agency, and their perspective. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sean.
Hi everyone, I am Lindsay Singer. I teach third grade at Chavez Elementary School. This is about to be my 8th year in education, and I am also a graduate of UTEP. I am here because I am a white woman working in spaces that are filled with predominantly Black and brown students. More specifically, I hold a position of power as a teacher in a community that is over 90% Latinx. And so I do this work because I need to. White supremacy is so ingrained in our systems that if I don't actively fight against it, I automatically become part of the problem.
Thanks, Linz.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan White. I teach 5th and 6th grade ELA at Pritzker Elementary in Wicker Park. This is my 3rd year as a teacher, and I was a part of cohort 14 for UTEP. And my purpose for being with you here today is that I stand in the legacy of many educators and ministers and blue-collar workers who have been resisting racism for over 400 years, and I feel very responsible in keeping this conversation ongoing and alive. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you all of you for being here, for sharing a little bit with us. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Kei Fujiyoshi. I'm a UTEP instructor. I teach a foundations course, which is basically a 3-part series where we really dig it deeper into the context of the city of Chicago, thinking about the place in which we're preparing students to live and thrive and inherit. And in order to do this work, we're really, I actually come from the northern neighborhood of West Rogers Park. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. I'm actually a product of CPS. I graduated from Lane Tech High School, and as I started my teaching career, I went back and I started as a high school English teacher in CPS, and also I taught it in a charter school, and I was really disenchanted. And almost like it felt like I got hit by a truck to think about the disparities of what my education was like and the sort of educational experiences and reasons that other children were not able to have access to. I started my journey as a teacher educator because I felt like there were gaps and limitations in the knowledge that I had gained from my own teacher education programs, and largely being around race and segregation in the city of Chicago and how that impacts student outcomes. And so I started on this journey with cohort 10. We're now in cohort 18, so it's been a minute. But I come to this work, I use she, her pronouns. I'm an able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, Japanese American female. And I come to this work because, number one, my mom told me that I am put on this earth to do good work. And so I try as much as possible to think about the energy that I have on this earth and what I want to do with that energy while I'm here. And I really believe that teaching is a sacred position. That we are entrusted with our youth, our children, our beloved, and those beloved of others. And so we have an extreme responsibility to nurture the future and to care and to love each of these individuals to be prepared to inherit the earth. And as we think about what the conditions of our earth right now, we know that there is a lot of work to do. And so I come to this work and I come to this conversation really believing that teaching is a pursuit of love. And if we take stock of where we're at right now as a society, we know that there is much work to be done. And we also know that that work sort of begins with us. And so that's a little bit about us. We would really like to know, if all of you wouldn't mind, what brings you here to this conversation? So if you wouldn't mind using the chat box, we'd like to just kind of hear out from some folks. We know I saw some former UTEPers. Hey, Peter. If everybody wouldn't mind just to just share a quick blurb, a sentence or so of what brings you here to this conversation. Why are you here wanting to learn about inclusive practices and implementing anti-racist teaching methods? And we'd like to keep that chat rolling to think about just who we have in the room, and also We also want to keep it moving because we know we have a lot to share with y'all. But I just want to say really quickly that when we were thinking about this conversation, we make a choice to be anti-racist because we believe right now that equity, justice, and human dignity is absolutely essential in this moment. Meaning every person should have the tools, resources, and opportunities to live up to their full human potential and capacity. And right now, as many of you may have been, right, we have been inundated just with pictures and images of that not taking place and that not happening, and extreme violations of that. And so we're really grateful that all of you are here and that all of you are making a choice to make some intervention in your classroom, in your practice, in your schools, and in whatever profession that you may be coming from. That this is all a moment in which we're taking to think about how we can get better, how we do better, how we become better for the sake of the children. So thank you. We want to start with a definition of racism and anti-racism. So when we think about racism, right, I'm actually using the definitions from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And we're also going to share some resources through some of the things that we've been reading and talking about recently as well. But he describes a racist as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. And then an anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And at the core of anti-racism, what we want to talk about today is love. And if we think about anti-racism being something that is against something that is limiting the capacity of the full human potential and capacity, then we also really want to get to the root at what is making us think, support, or believe, right, that is okay. And so we really want to get to this root of what it means to love, because then the opposite of that is hatred, of thinking that somebody is beneath or not worthy of. And so we want to think about the word love. And just to get you all involved in the conversation again, maybe in a word, what does love mean to you? Care, support, recognizing, understanding, warmth, liberation, safety, fairness, connection, compassion. Yes, yes, yes. And we want to just kind of give a working definition for how we're using it in this space, because we know love is a lot more complicated and love is a lot more difficult than we may think, right? You can, like, now love is sort of a commodity. Love can be, love is marketed to us all the time in terms of, Hallmark cards or what is that called? Match.com. You can buy love, right? Or you can attempt to attain love in some ways. But we're thinking about love as the energy that links all of us together as human beings in the human family. It's the key to transformation. It's a decision, a promise, and a commitment. It's also a practice. So love is an action. It's a verb. It's something that we do. It's a practice towards care, towards compassion, towards kindness, protection, and the nourishment of the self and others. And so this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, if you can just see it up there, love is the capacity to take care, to protect, to nourish. If you are not capable of generating that kind of energy toward yourself, if you are not capable of taking care of yourself, of nourishing yourself, of protecting yourself, it is very difficult to take care of another person. In the Buddhist teaching, it's clear that to love oneself is the foundation of the love of other people. Love is a practice. Love is truly a practice. And so we want to also just say that, a loving practice also begins with the self, and that also requires a lot of self-reflection. And in this practice of love that we are striving to commit to, we're also thinking about what is it as a practice. And so some of the things that we do at UTEP to prepare our teachers is thinking about what that practice is. And so there are 6 things that we'd like to share with you today. In terms of what that commitment looks like. So a practice of love is a commitment to reflection, vulnerability, knowing, learning and unlearning, humility, transformation. And so reflection. When we, in the UTEP program, we're always asking students to think about themselves in context. Think about their positionalities that they're bringing into the classroom space with them. All of this baggage that we bring in is going to impact the way in which we engage with students. It's also going to impact the way in which we, our practices roll out. And so we want to just constantly have that muscle of reflection involved. And when we think about teaching towards a vision. One that will bring true change to society, acknowledging that our human and our environmental survival and prosperity actually are connected to our day-to-day work in the classroom. I think in the throes of the year, right, it can be very much survival mode in which you're just trying to get through the days. But in thinking about that time that we have with children to really nurture their minds and nurture their souls, this is work that maybe we're planting seeds, but those seeds can grow later on in the future. And so we sow into that. And I think Jasmine wanted to share a little bit about her own reflection process at UTEP.
Yes, thanks, Dr. K. So going into UTEP, I thought that because I could talk about anti-racism intellectually and believed in its value, that I would automatically be an anti-racist educator. But taking intentional time through the program within a critical framework to reflect on whether my ideals aligned with my practice allowed me to see that that wasn't enough. I was telling my students Black Lives Matter, but what was I doing to stand up to the unacceptably high rates of discipline against Black boys in my class? Not enough. Was the structure and the content of my lessons culturally responsive? Not enough. Having the time, space, and support to reflect on what components of my practice were and were not anti-racist was and continues to be essential to my ability to address my growth points as an aspiring anti-racist educator.
Thanks, Jasmine. When we think about like I just want to rest on what she just shared for a moment, because I feel like those moments of reflection also create moments of vulnerability, which we're also going to get to. But in thinking about, I think this also gets to like the question of, I just listened to this podcast that Bill Ayers had, in which Crystal Laura was featured. And in that podcast, one of the things that caught me was, he said, life can be understood looking backward, but lived moving forward. And so I'm thinking about how it is that we want to live moving forward based on what we understand looking backwards. And so we have a lot of reflection questions up here that we'll also share with you later on. But I think one of the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, how should I act? What do I do? What do I believe in this particular moment? And if we have a choice of how it is that we want to be, how is it going to be? And to ask the question of, who am I? How will my understanding of self shape my perceptions of and interactions with children, families, and communities in the context of teaching and learning? And like Jasmine said, how do my ideas actually align with what it is that I'm doing? Questions for consideration. So in reflection, what do I believe about how Black and Brown children can participate in the world? And we ask these types of questions at UTEP to get at the core of why it is that we're stepping foot in the classroom. What business do we have with working with children if at the core of our beliefs, there might be something a little twisted? What narratives am I enabling? Are kids bad? Does the kid that arrive in my class from 4th grade backwards, who's been bad every single year, continue to be bad, and therefore I no longer have to do anything with that kid? Am I giving myself an excuse because I've also bought into the narrative of who this child is and therefore have limited their capacity for growth? How do I talk about Black and Brown children? So monitoring our language, monitoring how it is that people around us, right, are speaking about Black and Brown children, but also how it is that we participate in those conversations. Is my language based in deficit assumption? So am I automatically assuming that Black children, their communities, their families are somehow damaged? And just to be aware of those things. Also to be aware of how people are coming at it around you, because all of that seeps into the environment and creates a particular culture. Do I believe that there is something inherently wrong with Black and Brown children, their families and communities? These are really, of course, the answer that we all want to give is no. But I think when we look beyond the surface and when we start to pay attention to our language, how is it that anti-Blackness has also crept into the way in which we think and the things that we believe? Which leads us to our next point of vulnerability. We must begin by looking inward and having the courage to look in the mirror and embrace ourselves exactly as we are in all of our imperfections. To be vulnerable means to acknowledge a weakness and to be exposed. We say this at UTEP a lot, and I think this is also, but we say, admission is the first step to recovery. So we have to be willing. I think that's also Alcoholics Anonymous. Sorry, it's not from my actual practice, but it, anyhow. So admission is the first step to recovery. So how do we begin to look in the mirror and be vulnerable? Because the heartbeat of racism is denial. So if we are in a moment of denial, then you can never fix it. And we're taught everything around us, our entire society is set up, right, to teach, to sort of feed us anti-Black sentiments of anti-Blackness. And so we want to talk about vulnerability. And I believe John and Danielle, you guys are gonna give us some food for thought, please.
Thank you, Kay. So I'm telling you, vulnerability is a scary word, especially when you come into a classroom where you are expected to be the power in the classroom. And so I just wanted to share maybe 2 anecdotes of how I was able to sort of demonstrate this attribute of vulnerability and expose my weaknesses and my pain and my imperfections. So the first anecdote, it took place during my first year of teaching back in 2018. My father had just passed that previous January. And so I was coming into the classroom grieving. And I believe it was during a writer's workshop where I wanted to model for my students what a personal narrative should sound and look like. And instead of me giving something that was formulaic or scripted, I allowed myself in that moment to talk about my dad. And in that moment, in that process of doing so, I actually began to cry. It was not something that I anticipated or expected. It wasn't even something that I wanted to do, but it was a space where I allowed myself to grieve in front of my students. And as I did that, I gained a certain respect and love and compassion for my students that I wasn't really expecting. And so I allowed myself to become human before them. And I think that's something that's very important. As teachers, we have to allow ourselves to be humanized. We have to humanize ourselves before we can humanize our students. And this is still within the realm of anti-racism because racism assumes that a human being is either greater than or less than. And so we have to bring it back to the human level. So I allowed myself to become human. Another way that I was able to demonstrate vulnerability in my classroom space was creating an evaluation system for my students. I allow my students to actually interrogate my practice and evaluate me. And the reason why I think this is important as it pertains to vulnerability is that I am, in a sense, surrendering some of my power and giving my students autonomy and voice. Because as I'm teaching them what it means to actually speak truth to power, I myself have to be the embodiment of that and allow them to say, hey, Mr. White, when you said this, you hurt my feelings. Or hey, Mr. White, the way you did something or the way you maneuvered, it made me feel like I was less than. And I didn't like that. I feel like you should change that. And I allow myself to be sort of surrendered to their thinking. And as I have continued that practice, I've learned a lot about myself, and I've learned about my students' capacities for compassion and growth and their ability to teach me as well. So I think that's a very, very important attribute as you're bringing that into that space.
Absolutely.
I like that you mentioned being human. For me, being vulnerable in my classroom was just being human. I noticed that my little third graders think that I'm like some superwoman and nothing that I do is ever wrong, or they don't expect adults to make mistakes. And I kind of open up a space for my students to call me out as well. Even though they're third graders, they catch certain things as well. And I usually leave our time for our entire class to kind of be vulnerable during our SEL meetings in the morning. Those are very good times to kind of get to know students and be vulnerable with them, tell them things about you, and learn a lot about them. Students love to share things about themselves. So I find that to be a very good time to also be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think when we are thinking about vulnerability, and I think this is, part of the questions that we ask at UTEP is to really think about what does it mean to be human. And I think, when we're in the day-to-day of life, there is some sort of standard of perfection that we try to, strive for, and that's false. And so when we think about our own weaknesses, And I know that we're looking at it through this lens of being in a world in which, you know, white institutional racism is around us, and we're taught to be that we are less than in different ways. And so to think about striving towards that, that moment of perfection is something that we also have to start to undo in our own thinking. And as we start to humanize ourselves through allowing ourselves to be imperfect, allowing ourselves to not be everything, giving ourselves that grace, then we can also sort of give that grace to others too. Questions for consideration. So when we're thinking about vulnerability, you know, am I addicted to racist ideas? You know, how do I benefit from believing in them? You know, this kind of goes back to like how it is that we buy into the narratives of students. Does that give us off, then are we off the hook then for not working with those few students that are, you know, that may have some troubles in our classrooms because that's just been their MO, right? So thinking about how it is that, you know, we're benefiting from those ideas. And that's just, and there are much larger racist policies, right, that are, we're also needing to sort of address. Like, are there inequities in my classroom, school, and city? So thinking about like, are we supporting zero tolerance policies in our classroom? What is our systems of punishment in our classroom? How do those feed into the school to prison pipeline? And are we doing that just because our administrators say that that's okay and that's what we should be doing? Or are we really thinking about how to do things differently? How do we start to think about healing? How do we start to think about restorative justice? And so when we get to this place of vulnerability, we also want to think about this may show us gaps and limitations, right, in what it is that we think that we know. And so loving also inspires knowing. So the goal of knowledge arising from love is the reunification and reconstruction of our broken selves and world. So thinking about how it is that knowledge, right, of knowing something new, of getting to know something, that we can start to really reunite ourselves with the world. A knowledge born of compassion aims not at exploiting and manipulating creation, but at reconciling the world to itself. So it's not to just attain, so it's not just to say like, all right, everybody's going to college. Now you attain this degree. Now you get this level status in society, right? Now you can go on and work at a job that's also going to continue to exploit and continue to be racist and continue to be just a terrible human being, right? It's not about that type of lifestyle and that attainment of knowledge, but what is our responsibility to the knowledge that we have about what we know in the world? And so when we think about knowledge rooting from the stem of love, then how does compassion begin to sort of get cultivated inside of that? And so Lindsay and Danielle are both going to talk about some of their experiences at UTEP and also in the classroom, thinking about if racial inequity is based on power, policies, practices, and processes, how do we get to know about that?
Thanks, Kay. So in a second, Danielle is going to talk about how knowing our students is so important to the work we're doing. But I think that there's an extra layer of that for teachers that we don't always think about. So during my time at UTEP, we spent a lot of time with community organizations and community organizers. I personally got to work with Dr. K's husband, JR, at the anti-eviction campaign. And we spent a lot of time thinking and learning about the public housing crisis in Cabrini Green, and then who was being given the right to return. And since then, I've continued to seek out information about the neighborhoods in which I work. As teachers, if we don't understand the housing policies, the immigration policies, the police brutality that's happening in our students' backyards, we can't truly say that we know our students. All of these systems are interconnected. So it's our responsibility as teachers and as humans to continue to be in the know when it comes to policies and laws that systematically oppress our kids. And in turn, that's how we're going to have a better understanding and understand what kind of prior experiences and prior knowledge our students are coming into our safe spaces with.
Thanks, Lindsay. So going back to students as humans, when I enter my classroom, I am very intentional about my efforts for getting to know my students. That looks like asking follow-up questions to the things that they share about, you know, their family or their weekend, digging a little deeper to kind of get that genuine, to express that genuine interest, right? But in addition to that, it kind of creates this bond of trust that we get that I get from my students as I'm asking those questions, right? So the trust that I need from them allows me to also empower them through education. And I found that even some of my most reluctant students at the beginning of the year were a lot more trusting. They were willing to allow me to push them. They were willing to allow me to empower them because of the bond that we had created during the time of me getting to know them and observing them and watching them and seeing their needs, and them kind of getting able to have the feeling that I was genuine in my care for them. It's just about gaining that trust. I think that's the key.
Thanks, Danielle and Lindsay. We want to think about, like, how do we get to know our students, and really building that foundation of relationship. When we're really trying to look at the student in front of us as a human being, then we know that those students are coming in with their own experiences, their own sets of knowledges, their own tool banks, right, that can be utilized. But we also have to, again, all these practices are kind of like cyclical in some way, right? And they don't happen, one right after the other. But it also forces us to this point of vulnerability too, right? Like, what assumptions am I making about the students in front of me? How do I really get to know them? How do I get to know their communities? Sometimes we have, teachers that are parachuting in from other places in the city into different areas in the city, right? Not living within the community. So how do you get to know what is actually happening in the day-to-day lives of the students and the families that you're serving? The systemic analysis of communities that we have our students do as an exercise at UTEP is really powerful in the sense that they are working with community-based organizations and community leaders to think about how is it that the communities have already their own knowledge sets, that they are already working towards redevelopment and also community-led development, and how are we seeing their work, right? How do we see our work in relation to their work? Are we seeing our work as being saviors to these communities, right? Or are we taking a step back to say, what's already being done here and how can I be an ally? And I think that's very different than automatically thinking that you can parachute in and save everyone. And so that we're also going to share that assignment with you just to show, because I think that also gets deeper into the workings of the city. So it's not just to look at the community from just an observational point of view, but to really think about what jobs are available there. What's the history of housing like in that neighborhood? How were they impacted by the plan for transformation and Renaissance 2010? Was housing taken away? Were there schools closed down? How did that impact families? How did that impact the walk to school? How did that impact safety? And so thinking about all of these different components, right? And also where do people work? Do they have to travel long distances? What is a day in the life of a parent, and what is that struggle? And if a student is showing up late every day, are we meeting them with kindness? Are we meeting them with love, or are we meeting them with punishment? You're late again, right? How do we know that kid is not walking siblings to school? How do we know that kid wasn't up all night? What are the things that we don't know that we need to sort of take a step back from our assumptions and the narratives that we may have been enabling to really get to know what's happening? And not only that, but to get to know the city, right, in ways so that we are also equipped to prepare them for this world that they are going to inherit and also have to navigate. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat box. I just want to say, moving forward, thinking about what is our own knowing process? How are we equipping ourselves as lead learners in the classroom space, right? How do we keep our wheels turning? How do we keep ourselves invested in it? And part of it is also, joining PD sessions. Questions for consideration, like in reflection, what do we know about the purposes and functions of urban schools? How are we taught that in our teacher education programs? In what ways do various contextual factors, historical, social, political, and economic, impact the quality of schooling? What is the system? When we talk about the system, and what roles and functions do we play in it? Things for us to get to know better. And so this quote again by Thich Nhat Hanh, obviously you can tell I kind of like Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, the essence of love and compassion is understanding, the ability to recognize the physical, material, and psychological suffering of others, to put ourselves inside the skin of the other. We go inside their bodies, feelings, and mental formations and witness for ourselves their suffering. Shallow observation as an outsider is not enough to see their suffering. We must become one with the subject of our observation. We are in contact with another suffering. A feeling of compassion is born in us. Compassion literally means to suffer with. And I think this is for all human beings. And this is, you know, work that I think that we have to model with one another at UTEP. Because conversations about race are not easy. When you're in a space in which, and I think all of our UTEPers give me a thumbs up if you can also testify to the fact that conversations of race were not easy as we were having them. They're not kumbaya moments. They're not, you know, there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of pain that comes up in it, especially when you're looking at everybody's positionality all in one space, and it's hard to sometimes have those conversations with folks that don't understand your own personal experience, when you're not understanding the experience of the other. And so compassion is something where we're trying to get better at also connecting on a human level. We're all impacted by white supremacy, white people included. And that's a big part of that dehumanization process, is for someone to dehumanize another, they first have to be dehumanized. And so we get it deeper into those conversations, one, so that we can get to a bigger place of compassion. How do we start to, you know, how do we have students of color in a room talking with white students, and then being able to come back the next day? That's the hard work. And that's part of the challenge, but it's also towards, right, this bigger vision that we're trying to keep in mind, that we stick with it, that we're still in it. And so that kind of leads us to the learning unlearning process. And so Kevin Kumashiro, one of my mentors, you know, talks about learning happens through crisis. And this means that we already have a sense of what the world is, right? We've kind of formulated an idea of what we understand about it. And learning through crisis means that we are putting ourselves in a position to have that worldview somehow disrupted. And when that worldview gets disrupted, like, oh my, like, you know, this is not so much recently, but, you know, I had students that would be like, oh, I never thought about race until I took this class. And, you know, like as a person of color, I was like, what do you mean you've never talked about, or like never thought about it? Like it wasn't even a part of your, like, any consciousness, like floored, right? And so in thinking about like how it is that we are disrupting, you know, our worldview, our sense of the world, what do we gain out of that process? But you know, unlearning something can be very uncomfortable. And that discomfort sometimes when we're in a space where we're either going through that or somebody around us is going through that, that can lead to resistance, to shutdown, to like, I'm not going through this anymore because it's uncomfortable and I'm done, right? People are no longer able to listen. But if we hang in there, right, and think about this unlearning process and commit to it, right, then we think about the outcome, which is a reorientation to the world. And Lindsay, you wanted to share about your unlearning process.
Yeah, so I'm going to be completely honest. Unlearning was an extremely important part of my journey. When I started teaching, I was 22 years old. I was working in a new charter school and continually being told that because I was a good leader, I was automatically going to be a good teacher. I was constantly getting this message of, you are so amazing for doing this work. So it's important that the savior complex can manifest in many different forms. But for me, it came into fruition as this need to be a fixer. I needed to fix the academic problems in my classroom. I needed to fix my students' mindsets. I needed to fix everything to do my job well. But what I realized through this reflection process, through my time at UTEP, and honestly still now, is that I was very focused on myself. I was focused on what I thought I needed and not what my students needed. And it's important because, as Kay mentioned, this unlearning is uncomfortable, but it's also become my driving force. It's the reason that I focus on creating restorative and healing spaces for my students. It's the reason I push for social justice education and problem-solving based learning. And it's the reason that I continue to do this in my own personal growth. And the truth is, I do not think I could be the teacher that I strive to be one day if I still held these mindsets and if I wasn't consciously working on creating new ones.
Thanks, Linz. And I think, you know, in that unlearning process, what that leads us to is humility. And humility isn't thinking less of yourself, right? But it is thinking of yourself less, right? So as Lindsay was saying, like taking ourselves out of the center of things. Humility isn't something natural. It requires some discipline, some concentration, patience, faith, and the overcoming of narcissism. And so when we really think about this work, we think about our bigger vision for what it is that we want for children and the role that we play in that development of our future, then we have to think about like, okay, this isn't necessarily about me, Kei Fujiyoshi. This is actually about me getting better so that I can do this thing that I say and commit that I am trying to do. And humility makes us teachable. Sean, Danielle, and John are going to share with us a little bit about their own reflections on humility.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me, Dr. K. I'm humbled to be here. And like you are probably feeling right now, and like I am now and was a couple years ago in Dr. K's class, you're feeling motivated because you've had your perspective on this work affirmed, or you've had a shift in your thinking, and now you're ready to bring all this into your classroom space. But I think it's really important right now to just accept and understand that you're going to make mistakes. There's going to be moments of failure. We're imperfect, and those momentary failures shouldn't let you stop doing that long-term work. So just speaking from my experience as a white male teacher, I'd echo a lot of what Lindsay said. People who are so willing to give me the benefit of the doubt. And in my first year of teaching, I had a homeroom where behavior management was a challenge. And I was fed all these narratives from fellow teachers, that's how that class was, or, their behavior was that way because they didn't want to listen to a man, or they didn't want to listen to white people. And a lot of the strategies on top of that I was given to manage behavior looked a lot like the policing practices that are being protested right now across the country. And as a new teacher, it felt a lot easier to hear those narratives or adapt those strategies than it was to challenge those, because, it's challenging ultimately myself, but also the administration and all these systems that are in place. So, for me, the humility piece was so crucial to step back and just say, no, I'm a leader in this space, and what is it about my teaching that is contributing to this? But coming to that not from hearing my other teachers or what do I think, but from really listening to my students, and that practice of vulnerability that John spoke to, of coming to that space and really hearing students, and then also validating those perspectives by adapting your pedagogy. And so I think it's also important just to emphasize, what Kay said earlier about these racist stereotypes that get internalized. For me, in my space, as a white person, I'm not in a position to favor white students over black students, but that certainly does happen. And, from looking at the chat, there's white teachers in diverse spaces, right? I'm not saying you're doing that, but that is a reality for a lot of students of color. But as a white teacher in a black space, I'm still in a position to be colorist, right? I could be discriminating against students with darker skin, or who wear their hair natural, or whatever other racist stereotypes get baked into, white Americans. So it can be informative to hear from students, but it's also just deeply personal work, and it requires a lot of introspection and kind of uncovering those uncomfortable feelings or realities on your own, and then bring that into that space, and not to let those feelings stop you, but to use that framing of love and these habits of anti-racism yourself, to ask those difficult questions, hear those difficult answers, and then show up each day just trying to be better.
Piggybacking off of that, Sean, for me, humility came in as acceptance, kind of like with Lindsay. It was my first year. I was going into CPS with the understanding or the thought that students were being cheated of their education. And here I am. I felt the need to, or I felt it was my job to uplift and empower these babies, right? I wanted them to master every single skill. I felt responsible for the level of excellence that I wanted them to attain, and make up for all of the deficits and all of the ways that I thought they had been cheated. So what I had to later come to appreciate is that maybe not all of my babies are going to be or grow in the different ways or master every skill that I wanted them to gain, but they all walked away with seeds for learning. When I went back and I did my little evaluation for my third graders, and asked them what did they feel like they took from their third grade year. A lot of them said that they learned a lot and they felt really comfortable in the spaces that I had created. And that was humbling in itself, knowing that I had planted those seeds, and it actually, it came from something. My babies walked away from something, with something, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Daniel, what you just said really resonates with me. So my journey into education actually began with me leaving the corporate world. I was in corporate marketing for about 10 years as a graphic designer. And one of the things that I learned in that space was what we Black professionals call the Black tax. And under this notion of racism, the Black tax simply means that I, as a Black cisgendered male, I have to perform twice as good as my average white male counterpart in order for me to be actually competitive. And so as I left the corporate world with this mentality, this work ethic, I came in with that sense of I have to do more. I have to do more. And I was greeted at the doors of education with a deficit perspective or deficit narrative of Black males in education. I can't tell you how many times I was told, we're so happy to have you. There's only 2% of Black male educators nationwide, and you're one of the good ones. You're one of the good ones. And so I'm coming in to the classroom feeling this burden of the Black tax. I got to do more. I got to achieve more. And just like what Daniel said, having these high expectations for my students and for myself. And I didn't realize that I was actually demonstrating some internalized racism, that deficit perspective on myself, that I actually have to do more to be good enough. And part of the unlearning process was for me to humble myself and accept the fact that I was good enough, that I didn't have to do more to be accepted, that I was good enough. And so as I began to live into that sort of posture, I noticed that it also began to sort of impact my students in a very positive way as well. And I'm still learning that process.
Which brings us to our last point, which is transformation. And John's going to talk to us more about transformation.
So transformation is a fascinating process because I know that in my experience, it requires a kind of synthesis. I have to extract so many different themes and elements from my background knowledge, from my experiences, from my failures, from outside perspectives about me, my own positionality, and my own learnings. And I have to find a way to bring myself to a conclusion in that transformation process, in that synthesis, to say, this is where I'm going to begin to change. And I think one of the ways that I did that, and one of the ways that you can do this as well, is to evaluate what you're taking in. I check your diet. As it correlates to what we mentioned about the unlearning and the learning process, part of that process is evaluating what you're reading. What's your daily intake of the media? What stereotypes are you buying into? Who are you listening to? What voices are you allowing into your space to mentor you and guide you? I think it's a very important process because you are what you eat, as they say. And so I think making sure that you are evaluating what you're reading on a daily basis, that will allow you to interrogate your notions, your preconceived misconceptions about who you are, as well as your relationship to your brown and Black students of color in your space. This is a painful process. I wish I could give you a message of joy and glee. I will say, though, that you will be happy with the result. You're going to like yourself a little bit better. And I think that you're going to make a greater impact in your space. But you must commit to this process and embrace the suffering of it all, definitely.
Thanks, John. And, I think one of the things that we also want to emphasize is that, it's not like, you go through the metamorphosis, right? And then you're done. It's a constant back and forth, right? We have different moments in which, we're sort of awakened to an idea that we've held on to that, that we need to let go. And so it's not to say that at some point we arrive, right? But that it's also just a constant commitment and recommitment to this practice, to an ongoing practice of seeing ourselves in the context of the world and asking ourselves every day, how do I want to be? And am I making the correct intervention? Am I making the right interventions to get to that place? And so lastly, we kind of want to ask all of you, we've gone through some of reflection, vulnerability, knowing, learning, unlearning, humility, transformation, and sort of in your own practice of love, where do you see yourself sort of starting your work? if you would all like to chime in somehow and thinking about, you know, where are you sort of in this process right now, and what are sort of the challenge that you're putting out to yourself. And as those start to come in, you know, we would like, you know, in some ways, like, it's just kind of nice to be able to have people just, you know, make that commitment in just one word of thinking about what that might mean for you. And even just thinking about how you're going into the school year, you know, what is that going to be like? You know, how do we make those small commitments? And as you are all thinking about those commitments that you'd like to make, we also want to share with you some implications for the classroom. So Lindsay is going to share with us. Lindsay, do you want me to share the YouTube one, or can you all see this?
Let's start with Dilo Fuerte. So hi again, friends. Kay asked us at the beginning to kind of think about what we believe children can do in our world. And so something that I believe wholeheartedly to be true about our students is that they can take part in social justice and activism-based learning. My partner teacher, Ashley McCall, said something recently that really stuck with me. She said, the right age for social justice learning is today years old, meaning that it doesn't matter how old our students are, they should be engaging in this work. And so 3 years ago, Ms. McCall and I planned a interdisciplinary unit where our students in reading are looking at social issues in book clubs, and at social studies, they're taking kind of this journey through social justice movements and activism, and that makes way for them to facilitate their own change. And so 2 years ago, my students were really almost baffled when they found out that when you Google our community, the first 50 articles on Google are about gun violence. And so they wanted to change the narrative. And so they became authors, illustrators, publishers, and we created the magazine Dilo Fuerte. So if you go to dilofuerte.com, you can still read all of their work and learn more about the community that they know and love. This year, it was a little more challenging because we were remote, but it was still really important that we do something. And so our students were, again, focused on this idea that our community was really low in terms of filling out the census. And so they created a webinar to inform people about the census, persuade them to take it, kind of get rid of some of the myths in our community about the census. And so we put on a webinar kind of like this. Our students did. We took a back seat. You didn't even see us. And we had over 150 participants. And you can also watch our webinar online because we taped it. So I'm really passionate about this. If this is something you are also passionate about, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you more about what this looks like in action and how this works. This is how I have kind of focused this work into the classroom.
Okay. Also, so some of these links are also going to be shared. Maybe we can share some of the links.
If you have any questions for us activists, please use
That's my kids.
So what we can do is I'll share these links in the chat with everyone. And then that way you can also have access to those. Sean, you were going to talk about some classroom management.
Yeah, that's a tough act to follow with Lindsay and her students there. But I just want to circle back, I guess, to talk about management and just with the idea that anti-racist curriculum is obviously super important, but without anti-racist classroom management, you're still going to be harming your students. You know, especially as a new teacher, the narratives that we hear about students, the strategies that we're given to deal with misbehavior, and the ways we manage our classrooms sometimes are going to mirror the type of policing and punishment that students are subjected to outside. So if we're going to disrupt that pipeline, it starts within our walls, and we can model the type of response to harm that we want to see outside. So there's an organization we got introduced to through UTEP here in Chicago called Umoja. They work in schools and have developed social emotional learning and restorative justice programs, and that would be a great resource for that. I'd also recommend smartclassroommanagement.com. It's a website written by an educator who emphasizes non-discriminatory management practices. And again, while all those are important, you know, these these strategies are great. It's, just want to emphasize this is deeply personal work. And, it starts by not just being an anti-racist teacher, but by being anti-racist full stop. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll post those links into the chat as well. Oh, it looks like Kay already got me. Thank you.
Going into my year with my students, I was very intentional about making sure that my students could see themselves in their literature. It was very, very important for me in a majority white, society. I wanted to make sure that my Black and brown babies, the few brown babies that I did have, but my Black and brown babies were able to see themselves in the readings, and they could see their culture and their stories in the stories that we were reading. So a lot of my classroom library were sources of books where they could see themselves, but I found some sites virtually that I began using that I really started to enjoy when we needed to do e-learning. One of the sites was was ReadWorks. I found they had differentiated assignments and readings, as well as very diverse stories. So you can find quite a bit for the difference in those stories. And after school was over and we were no longer in those platforms anymore, I gave my students a site called Libby. And Libby is like a complete bookstore full of books for students to try to check out and borrow. It's a virtual library, and they have such a great span of diverse readings as well. So if you guys want to share that as well, maybe I'll add that to the link. I'll add that link for you, Libby. Jasmine, go right ahead.
Yeah, in my journey toward anti-racist education, I've had to combat lower expectations for students of color that arise from racist tropes about behavior and intelligence. And one component that's really helped me to do that is relationship building, as Danielle has mentioned earlier. I learned I'm less likely to doubt a student's ability or motivation if I know what their dreams are, what they're struggling to overcome, and build trust with them. One example I have is I had a student a couple years ago that I struggled to understand, and every day he would tell me he hated me. And one day, after hours of back and forth, I told him I actually didn't believe that he hated me as much as he said he did, because we barely even knew each other. And I asked him what he was really mad about, and ended up finding out that he was having traumatic flashbacks throughout the whole school day, which gave me a completely different understanding of what he needed and an increased ability to empathize with and care for him. I mean, ultimately, this gave him a more equitable shot at self-actualization in a school environment, and realizing how much I would have missed if we wouldn't have had that interaction and if I would have written him off, really gave me a renewed determination to make sure I try to make that connection with every single student.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you guys for sharing some of the implications for classroom experience. I know that we're at time, and so we're going to wrap up our session here. And there's so many different ways in which this applies to the classroom experience. My kids are at the door. They're like, you said 4:30, and now you're done. It's 4:33. I'm getting called. But anyhow, some quick questions for consideration. How and why are you coming to the classroom or to your schools this year? What are you reimagining as you go into the school year? What is your purpose? And what is going to hold your feet to the ground? What is the space that you want to create with young people? And so these final questions at the end of our time together, we're really hoping that all of you are considering a different way of entering into the conversation with your students, of entering into conversations with your class, with your colleagues and with your schools, and really thinking about what it is that you're teaching towards in a very different way, given all of what 2020 has brought us. And so we want to share finally a link to readings, podcasts, TED Talks here. And lastly, we'll put that also in the chat, but I want to end with this quote from John Lewis, the late John Lewis, civil rights leader and congressman. And we'll also share a link to this piece that he wrote that was in the New York Times. He says, when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. And as I think back on the legacy and the life that he left behind for us, and the footsteps that he paved the way way for us. I really think that this is a time for all of us to think about who we are, who we want to be, and what the world that we're trying to leave behind is for our children, and for their sake and for their future. So thank you so much for all of you for attending, for being here, for being present, for wanting to be a part of this conversation, and for just the spirit and energy that you're going to bring into your classrooms, the impact that you'll have on your children. And, you know, lastly, we wish you a lot of peace. We wish you a lot of love going into the school year, and may your creativity and your joy just overflow onto those babies, whether it be through Zoom or in person or hybrid or however the entire school year is going to go. But we wish you all the best, and we know that your work is sacred, and we thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. K. Thank you so much to our panelists, Sean, Jasmine, Lindsay, Jonathan, Danielle. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us. I hope that everyone was able to get something for this training. I know for me, the thought, kind of framing this work around love, I think is an important concept for us to really, and how we show our love, whether in person or through Zoom, I think is important. For those of you for CPDUs, Carmela did put the link in the chat. So if you could click the link and fill out the form for us, and we will be able to get the certificate of completion to you. So with that being said, it's 4:36. We're going to log off. Our next session will be next Wednesday. It will also be with Dr. Mashiri Kills as well. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.